Alright, it's been a little over 6 months, so it is now time for another one of our biannual World Oil Situation Roundup videos. This is mainly going to be like a semi-podcast, so it's mostly going to be audio with a gradually shifting visual backdrop, just so it's not completely a black screen for however many minutes this lasts for. So, the last 6 months since our previous version of this have not failed to be interesting. Prices over the course of this half year began dropping down from the high points that they hit last year, reaching a bottom out point down near around $50 per barrel very recently, before they began jumping back up pretty quick, getting up towards, and for a little bit a couple days ago, over $60 a barrel again. So there's quite a number of wide-scale issues going on that are mainly dictating everything. Obviously, the one I'm suspecting is probably at the forefront of everyone's mind is the ongoing potential now for a U.S.-Iran conflict. Iran normally holds a plateau of around 4 million barrels per day of oil production. They are capable of, and once long ago did, hold a plateau of 6 million barrels per day. However, for the past bit of time, they have only been holding around 4. While during a bit of last year, and mainly during the first 6 months of this year, they began to drop pretty quickly, not because of depleting reserves, but because of sanctions being imposed on them. So they have now most recently dropped all the way down to only 2.3 million barrels per day of oil production, which is dropping down relatively close to their own domestic consumption level of about 1.9 million barrels per day. Now, tensions have been rising between Iran and the U.S., plus, with the plus being the other Persian Gulf nations around Iran. The reason for the tensions recently escalating has been a series of repeating attacks on various oil and oil refinery product tankers in the Strait of Hormuz, as well as several rocket attacks on several locations in Iraq, and several apparent drone attacks on Saudi oil pipelines, all of which everyone is accusing Iran of being behind, while Iran is saying obviously it wasn't Iran. The U.S., in preparation for the potential conflict, has moved into the Persian Gulf an additional aircraft carrier naval strike group that's on top of the U.S. Fifth Fleet, which is already permanently stationed in the Persian Gulf. And also on top of that, in May sent an additional 1,500 ground personnel, and in June, most recently sent another 1,000 ground personnel, most likely being stationed at the U.S.'s base in Qatar, which is a roughly 10,000 personnel base. Numbers of actual combat personnel and combat vehicles at the base are undisclosed, obviously, along with already the roughly 40,000 personnel that the U.S. still has in Iraq. And as a top-off, the U.S. has sent over another entire fighter wing of F-15 Eagles and another group of F-22 Raptors. Now, this by all means could really just be politics and just a show of force to try to deter anything from escalating, but seeing the past and seeing how things have played out, I have my own suspicions that people will either agree with or disagree with. I don't really care. I rather suspect, honestly, that this is basically going to be a repeat of Iraq, including the actual reasons. With Iraq having enormous oil reserves, most of which were, for the longest time, untouched. Under Saddam, he never really took Iraq over 2 million barrels a day or so, kept it around or below that area, and obviously didn't like letting in outside oil and gas industry firms for any further resource exploration and development. So Iraq has always been capable of pumping probably somewhere between 7 and 9 million barrels a day, but they were never really taken above 2. And as we all know by this point, or at least everyone should be aware, that the whole harboring weapons of mass destruction thing was kind of a farce. My basic rundown suspicion is that some particular kind of U.S. intelligence was aware that what would become the first peak in global oil production would ended up being more of a flat line for about 3 years from 2005 or 2006 up until 2008. Some collective intelligence group was aware that that was coming, and Iraq, given its massive potential capability and the fact that, all of what was untouched there was onshore conventional oil. So, the easiest stuff to develop and get out. A plan was probably drawn up to try to mitigate or at least dampen the effects of the first production peak by initiating the conflict and the invasion and, deposing the Saddam regime, establishing a government friendly to the outside world, and then bringing in all the various oil and gas industries to rapidly explore and develop all of Iraq's untouched reserves. And what would be the expected aftermath of that is what happened. Iraq's oil production after the invasion began absolutely rocketing upwards and even hit recent highs of 5 million barrels per day. For the longest time up until recently, after the invasion, their domestic consumption was basically trashed. So up until the last couple years, basically all of that newly expanded enormous level of oil production was all being exported. And even though their domestic oil consumption levels have begun growing quickly again, still the overwhelming majority of what Iraq is pumping is being exported. Now, the massive rise in prices that followed, 3 years of basically stalled production globally, that, supplied the funding for and triggered a lot of new production in unconventional sources like shale and ultra-deep water, and even some Arctic ventures, and a lot of additional development of the Canadian tar sands. That was basically inevitable. However, the actual peak itself and the effects of it would have probably been a fair bit worse if it weren't dampened by the newly and quickly uplifted levels of Iraq production. So I basically have a sinking suspicion that something similar is going on here, and a similar plan may be being enacted, but with Iran this time, with the idea being that an invasion would be launched, the war would trash their economy and their infrastructure, which would obviously get rid of their 1.9 million barrel per day domestic consumption, drop it down into only a couple 100,000, and then in the aftermath, their fields and reserves would be quickly redeveloped, and they would be likely brought up to their real capability of 5 or 6 million barrels per day, nearly all of which would be being exported because their domestic consumption had been collapsed. This would be presumably being done secretly as a dampening effect for the second global oil production peak, which is looking to be somewhat around the corner in the earlier mid-2020s, as the remaining undeveloped unconventional sources of petroleum that would be pushed into being developed by the sudden upsurge in prices from a second peak are ones that would take even longer to initially start up. So there would be an even longer delay between the initial production stall and slump before it began climbing upwards again, as what's mostly left that's untouched is mostly Arctic, offshore Arctic, kerogen formations in the Green River area of Wyoming, Colorado, and Utah, extra heavy oil, potential deep interior Amazon deposits, and if anyone actually even wanted to try for it, potentially offshore Antarctica. So, is that what's actually happening? I don't know, but if a conflict does actually start, then I throw all my suspicion behind that being the reasoning behind it. I'd prefer it not to happen at all, obviously. So overall, there's the potential for that conflict looming, which has given a large part of the reboost to oil prices, and there is the loss so far from the sanctions of 1.7 million barrels per day of Iran's oil production. Now, moving across the world, we have also, since we put out the last one of these videos, lost about another 500 to 700,000 barrels per day of production from another nation, Venezuela. As Venezuela's social and economic and inevitably government collapse continues, I believe they are somewhere at 4 million people have fled the country at this point. Estimated numbers have ranged from between 40% to 70% of the nation's oil and gas workers have also taken their families and fled the country. So the collapse has been doing its own damage, and when it all began, obviously their oil production began to drop, which lowered their national revenue since they depend a lot on it, which made the collapse worse, and left them with less money to reinvest into their oil and gas infrastructure and fields, which then obviously resulted in production dropping further, and what I just said repeating itself, and so we've ended up with this negative feedback loop running endlessly. And now among the people who are still remaining in Venezuela, there have been mass protests constantly, as everything has broken down. In most places, there's no fuel, there's no food, some places even no water, and when there is any of those things, no one can afford it, which are being suppressed by police and military forces loyal to the current government of Venezuela. So Venezuela has dropped all the way down from their former plateau of 3 million barrels per day down to now just around 700,000 barrels per day. While obviously also their domestic oil consumption levels have been collapsing as the country collapses, and have collapsed more than half at this point and are down near around 400,000 barrels per day, which obviously that 700,000 barrel per day level of production is now very close to, at least compared to how far away that 3 million barrel per day production level was. So what remains of their export ratio is drastically shrinking, and so if their production levels continue falling any further and they basically lose their exports entirely, then they lose what little national revenue they have left, and then we obviously find out how much further down the bottom is from there. And one other primary source of ongoing losses is Mexico, formerly a large oil exporter, once back long ago held production levels at their peak of around 3.6 million barrels per day, while their domestic consumption level was obviously relatively low. Well, now they obviously, again, they peaked a long time ago and they've been on their terminal decline ever since. However, recently, the decline has picked up, and it's picked up pretty fast. And they've dropped from around 2.1 million barrels per day down to around 1.7, while their domestic oil consumption level is around 1.9 million barrels per day. So as we did already say in the weekly episode when it happened, Mexico has crossed the line into becoming a net oil importer. Now, obviously, there's also the OPEC production cuts. Those were enacted in place 6 months ago, however. They were renewed again at OPEC's latest meeting. They have agreed to extend them by at least another 6 months, potentially 9. Now, the losses we started off with have been offset elsewhere, obviously. One of the main places being the US, which in the first half of the year has gone up by a bit over another 500,000 barrels per day. Again, as before, most of it coming from the Permian shale. However, a new 100 or 150,000 barrels per day also coming from new fields being brought online in the Gulf of Mexico as well. However, growth in U.S. production has begun to slow down, as it was going to inevitably, and is now likely going to continue going up much more slowly. Russia also added another few 100,000 barrels per day of production as they continue to develop some fields in the Arctic, continue revitalizing some of their older regular fields, and are also continuing with development of the Bazhenov, I'm just going to pronounce it like that, shale. They were intending to continue to add more production, but they began to stop as part of their agreement with the OPEC Plus group. Kazakhstan, over the last 6 months, has added about another 100,000 barrels per day of new production. The UK has seen a bit of a sudden recovery, adding about another 200,000 barrels per day of new production as they finished activating several new fields that they've drilled in the North Sea, as most of all the North Sea stuff that was drilled in the past had been in the southern and central parts of the North Sea. However, now they in Norway have been developing fields in the northern part of the North Sea, as obviously basically everything in the southern and central parts of the North Sea has been found and developed. The UK has added another 200,000 barrels per day to the global total, bringing themselves personally back up from 900,000 up to 1.1 million barrels per day, although that's still all being consumed by themselves, as their domestic consumption level is around 1.6 million barrels per day. Canada, although expansion in the tar sands has been slowing, they also did bring online several new fields offshore of Newfoundland, so they added quite a bit. However, in the earlier part of this half of this year, they dropped it back down by 300,000 barrels per day because of a lack of pipeline capacity. However, now that 300,000 barrel per day reduction has almost been erased, and we've had a small group of other moderate contributors to the total. Brazil continues to add more, adding around 150,000 barrels per day of new production. The small African nation of Ghana continues to increase their production, adding an additional 50,000 barrels per day or so over the last 6 months. Egypt also has added about as much, as they finally brought some fields in the west out into production, and renewed production in Libya. has also helped to balance everything out. Although that production is iffy at the moment because Libya is in the middle of a renewed civil war. So for the moment, Libya is back up to holding about 1 million barrels per day, and they've been up around 2 million in the past before, obviously, everything started. And they had stated that they were hoping to bring themselves back up to that level. However, then, everything started again. So for the immediate future, there is the looming potential of a U.S.-Iran conflict, which would obviously cause a sharp upsurge in oil prices. It would also cause the immediate collapse of the remainder of Iran's oil production, although most of what's left is just feeding their own domestic consumption. So that would cause a loss of a further 2.3 million barrels per day of oil production, at least for the immediate likely year or two surrounding it. However, 1.9 million of that is consumed by Iran themselves, and that consumption would also collapse. So the net supply loss, so to speak, in comparison to the whole supply-demand balance would be minus 400,000 barrels per day. There is the, obviously, as just mentioned, looming potential for Libya's new civil war or civil conflict to potentially re-damage and re-shut down everything. So their resurging oil production could collapse again by any amount out of that 1 million barrels per day. It could drop a little bit down to 800,000, could drop all the way down to 100,000, nobody knows. Or nobody could touch the oil fields through the entire thing, and they could stay at 1 million. So Libya is completely a wild card at the moment. Guyana, over in South America, right next to Venezuela, is about to become an oil producer later this year. And by the first quarter of next year, they're expected to have 200,000 barrels per day of oil production online, and are basically expected to add about 100,000 additional barrels per day each year following that, up to an expected peak around 2024-2025 at between 700 and 800,000 barrels per day, as even though Guyana is a tiny country and their offshore area is equally as tiny, they have been finding so much oil offshore of that tiny little nation. And I highly expect that they're inevitably going to find more offshore there, and Guyana's actual peak in production will come further past 2025, and they will likely actually see something over 1 million barrels per day for a short period of time. So we are going to begin having those small additions from Guyana, as well as a quick, sudden addition from Senegal, as several offshore fields are being drilled in Senegal and are expected to start coming online next year and in the couple of years after that. And Senegal is expected to get up to around 200 or 300,000 barrels per day. Production from the U.S. is likely going to rise by another at least 400,000 by the end of the year, and the U.S. will probably end the year over 12.8. Canada will end up in the immediate future around the end of this year or so, or the first quarter of next year. Whenever those additional pipelines are completed, Canada will re-add that additional 300,000 barrels per day of production. Brazil, I don't have their exact schedule for bringing any particular fields online, so we can just probably safely assume they'll continue their pattern, and over the second half of this year, we'll probably see them add another 100,000, maybe 200,000 barrels per day. Venezuela may hold around this area, as they've been at around 700,000 barrels per day for the last 2 months, or, as always, the possibility exists, they might resume dropping. Mexico, on their terminal decline, is obviously going to continue dropping, and they're probably going to lose another 100,000 barrels per day before the end of this year, and are probably going to get down to 1.6 million barrels per day. Kazakhstan, again, likely to exceed 2 million barrels per day. Their total continued additions through the year might be anywhere between 50 and 100,000. Nigeria, which has been holding the first half of this year around 1.7 million barrels per day or so, will likely either over the second half of this year continue to hold that steady or bring themselves back up to their former plateau of around 2 million barrels per day. So we may get a 300,000 barrel per day production addition from Nigeria if they're able to bring themselves back up to level. And in terms of total global oil production and global oil consumption, both near the end of last year, did hit the triple digits. They both crossed over 100 million barrels per day, with global oil consumption's highest recent point during the first half of this year getting up to 100.7 million barrels per day, while global oil production currently, as of this moment, is around 100 million barrels per day flat. It was higher. It had gotten up over 101. However, because of all the additional lost production, it's now down around 100. So the supply-demand gap obviously was helping the production cuts' intention of further drawing down on crude oil inventories around the world, with the one main exception being the US, whose crude oil inventories were increasing up until just this most recent week. However, in the absence of all the further production losses during these 6 months, and in the absence of the supply cuts, global oil production would be expected to be just under 102 million barrels per day. So that's how it all stands for the moment. For our last few things, oil demand, I expect to probably get up to 101.5, 101.4 by the end of the year. I do obviously expect global oil demand to peak in and of itself, and I'm expecting that to be more so between 120 and 125 million barrels per day. But that's about it for all this. As unorganized as ever, I do apologize. Thank you, everybody, for listening in. If you liked hearing everything and you did actually listen all the way through, please leave a like on the video and comment something. It helps extremely. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Please consider helping fund my further existence, helping me deal with exorbitant medical expenses that have come up as of late. Links to my PayPal.me, Patreon, Redbubble shop, everything's in the description below. I will see everybody around next time.